gymnastics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I am joined today by Justin Holmes, a professor of political science at the University of Northern Iowa. But before we get started, it is almost the end of July as we record this, and I want to let everybody know that we are still working towards having video episodes. As you might have heard, we've talked about this at the beginning of our shows in July. We have been responding to all of these questions. When is this podcast going to wind up on YouTube or its associated kind of video content? And I'm going to be honest, as a full-time professor who is often teaching many overloads, or like this semester, once again, being the Faculty Association president, it's an additional production task. And so as Mike and I have now already said, we are committed to adding to it if we can get 25 people to either become new supporters or increase their level of support. And if we do that, then we'll start releasing video episodes. And I know that we're closing in on that here at 1 week left in the month. So be thoughtful about that because, again, you're going to get a bonus in July if you become a new supporter or if you increase your support. So if you do that, you'll be entered into a drawing for a free year of membership at whatever level of support you're currently at. So whatever level of support you add to here in July, that could become an entire free year. If you do it in the next week, get it done before the end of July. And finally, even if you don't win, you're still going to win because for the remainder of July, that's right, one more week, we've got a special discount. Either you get 90 off your first month, or you get 10% off for yearly supporters. Now, remember, we'd love to make that first month free, but Patreon doesn't allow for that. So we've either got 90% off your first month or 10% off for yearly supporters. And recall, if you're a yearly supporter, you're already getting a discount. And all of you will, again, be entered into that drawing to get a free year of membership at whatever level of support you're at. And additionally, make it possible to do video episodes. So if you want both a discount and a future where there are video episodes of The Politics Guys, head to the show notes right now for the discount codes and become a supporter or increase your support today. Well, Justin, after that bit of consumerism on the part, I tease, but in a sense, but it is true. I was thinking about this. I don't know about you. I probably do too many things in my life. And then I look around at other people who don't do stuff or they can't get the basic stuff done. What about you, Justin? Are you ready for a week of politics?
I am ready and willing and able and keeping it on the podcast for today so I can wear a grungy t-shirt and broadcast from the bunker of my basement, and I'm going to have to
we're both broadcasting from weird places today, but I want you to be honest. Your mouth said yes, but your tone said no. That was kind of like it was like a tired bar person going, I guess. Well, on that note, it's funny, but it's also true because I was pointing this out last time with Ken. I'm a little tired of leading with the story, but we're going to lead with the story, and that is Iran. So we get more financial and human costs to Iran coming out this week as the Secretary of Defense or War, whoever he is, former alcoholic Pete Hegseth, is in a combative hearing. Now, as we have pointed out, a lot of the purpose of committee hearings is to create sound clips, make TikTok reels. No, that's not a joke. I'm being honest about that part. What was telling about the committee hearing, though, was that the war with Iran is now, way surpassed the original estimate of $25 billion and has hit $37.5 billion in taxpayer money so far. Hegseth and the Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane defended the White House's massive $87.6 billion emergency supplemental request, warning that without immediate cash, the Pentagon will have to start shutting down domestic troop training exercises just to keep combat operations going in the Persian Gulf. Now, Justin, I did a little bit of math for us. I know I'm kind of a quant guy. So I took a look at the 2026 budget. Discretionary spending is about 1.9 trillion of the budget, or about 26% of all spending in this particular fiscal year. Of that, 950 billion went to defense. That's about 12 to 13% of the budget, which means that 87.6 billion additional dollars is a 9.2 increase over the annual budget, or another 1.2 increase of the total federal outlays. That includes both mandatory and discretionary spending. So it would be more than what Congress approved for at the height of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars in the mid-2000s. This is a huge number. I'm just trying to put it in context, because I think sometimes when we hear these numbers, you just kind of start to get lost. This is a huge amount of money on an already increased defense budget, right? As Ken pointed out a couple weeks ago, he's like, oh, this isn't going to be necessary. Even if we hold it, it's not going to matter because we've given them so much money. If we take them at their word, it is going to be a problem. Now, at the same time, and much more tragically, the U.S. casualty count as of Friday, July 24th, has hit 17, in part because on Thursday, Yemen's Iran-backed Houthis attacked Saudi oil tankers, this time in the Red Sea, which also saw oil this weekend now hitting $100, just a scooch over $100 a barrel. Of course, that is fluctuating all the time. That is of our talking about it here on Friday. So Arab diplomats reported to various news agencies off the record, including to the AP, that Gulf states are deeply pessimistic about an off-ramp. And likewise, the Wall Street Journal just this morning ran a behind the scenes on Donald Trump, who apparently is cursing about the inability of an off-ramp for Iran, and thinks the only scenario forward is more attacking. So, Justin, what do you think happens next? The Senate hasn't been willing to step in or curtail the war powers. Again this week, they defeated a motion to end the war 47-49 on Thursday. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one thing that was sort of interesting from the hearing is that Republicans were a little bit more critical, I think, than they have been. I mean, I think there has been some skepticism in the past, but certainly some of the questions, seemed a little more critical of the administration, because that is a big ask. I mean, I think there is that kind of tension on the Republican side between, defense spending is good spending, in their eyes, I think, but spending is not good, generally speaking.
Yeah, it is weird how you get that balance, but yeah.
Yeah, well, I've always been skeptical. It's not a question of how much government should spend between the parties. It's what they should spend it on, I think, is generally the divide.
Now you're starting to talk like a libertarian, but yeah.
Well, there you go. It's
I
too
like
early
that
for
I
that.
made you throw up a little bit in your mouth right there. You're like, oh my gosh, he's right.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. No, but anyway, but in all seriousness, I do think, I mean, one of the interesting things out of this, I think all of the, we've talked several times, we're on about once a month, and about once a month there's some kind of war powers resolution that, doesn't go anywhere. And even
or
if it
went
did,
somewhere and then got retracted.
And even if it did, it doesn't matter. I don't think, in the end. But I do think, kind of a twofold thing here. One is that, this is the real potential congressional power is funding. They have the power of the purse, so they don't have the power to undeclare war. They don't really, again, these resolutions are pretty toothless. I don't think there's much they can do legislatively to rein it in, but you could stop paying for it. And, that, I think there's some hint here. I mean, I think it'll probably get extended, but I think there's some hint here that, this is not going to be a blank check, even with
So you think they'll give him the 87 billion?
I think they'll give him part of it anyway. But I think the couple things that I think are interesting about this, though, coming at this from more of a comms perspective, is the framing in terms of domestic training rather than continuing the war effort. So that, I think, undercuts a little bit that argument of, this is the power that they have to, basically they're saying, we're going to go full steam ahead with this, is sort of what I'm hearing from the administration. Implicitly, we're going full steam ahead with this. We're going to cut somewhere else that you don't want cut if you don't pay. And so
it's kind of blackmail, effectively.
It is kind of blackmail. And, I think the other thing is that, we have so many of these, defense spending things the framing is so often, oh, won't you think of the troops, support the troops, kind of stuff.
Well, which is an
like
old take on, don't want you think of the children, right? That think of the troops.
I'm having a Maude Flanders moment.
Won't somebody think of the children?
But
Won't somebody think of the poor servicemen and women?
Yeah, but that's a very standard, anytime, any kind of pushback against, whether it's military operations or military spending, it's like, why don't you support our troops? And, so I think that's kind of an interesting pivot, and the administration, I think, is talking different things here. I think that's maybe a deliberate framing, their solution to this, or where they would cut is not Iran, and it certainly makes it feel like, this is just a done deal, that we're going to keep going in Iran, no matter what.
Well, I mean, more evidence in that favor, right? At the end, or near the end of the hearing, when Vice Chair Pat Murray is arguing with Hegseth about, the Trump administration is clearly in violation of the law here. And Hegseth argues back, look, we don't ever need authorization from Congress, because that unitary executive theory, he's not using those words, but because in his words, the executive branch holds the standalone Article 2 authority to conduct any operations it deems necessary, right? And so, no, that doesn't appear to be on the table at all. I agree with you. That fits with what he said, and I think it's worth taking him seriously.
Yeah, and I think it is interesting here, the costs of this, and there's, I've seen some, and I don't know, the veracity of this, but some claims that $37.5 billion is even an undercount, as far as spending. And, I think this is where, with the public, the support for this has never been good. And I think in the face of sort of continuing expenses, continuing losses, et cetera, I think the continued support of the public is going to dwindle on some level with this. It's really become kind of an albatross for the administration. Not that they were in great shape before,
but let's
in
think,
a lot of ways. Go ahead.
But if you think through this, I don't know if you saw in the Washington Post, a prominent Democratic proponent basically said, look, I don't have to have a good idea for how we end the war. The only thing we can do is pay off Iran. We got to pay. That was, as a matter of fact, the title of the piece, Pay Off Iran. And let's be honest, I mean, that would probably be even less popular
right,
than continuing the war.
Oh, I think for Democrats, politically, the best thing is for this to just keep going.
Right. Well, until it becomes their problem, because as we all know, when you take a look at electoral decision making, once they gain control of some things, they're going to start sharing the blame.
Yeah.
And it seems unlikely that this ends, and I actually agree with the author in this case. Unless you pay off Iran, I don't think you can end the war in the next few months. I don't see that as happening. It seems to me that the only logical next move is to actually invade Iran. I mean, I have thought about that carefully. Do you think
I'm
I've
kind of shocked
there?
that it hasn't happened yet, in all honesty. I'm a little curious what's holding that back, and I think some of it is that Trump, and I think the American public, just does not have the stomach for troop losses.
You're right. And if you think 17 is bad, I mean, just think back to what it was like when we were in Afghanistan and Iraq. Again, whatever you thought about it, just empirically speaking, you don't fight wars without losing people.
Right. That's war. And and interestingly, I don't know if you caught this, but and I don't know if the 17 reflects it or not, but they actually took 4 troops off the combat deaths roll because they died.
When did that happen? I didn't see that.
Yesterday or the day before, because they died in that interim period where we briefly were not at war because of the ceasefire that didn't hold. So, but I think that speaks to, 2 things. One, just the general crassness of all of this, and why I kind of make the sneering, would somebody think of our troops kind of thing, is, when you pull stuff like that, but.
Well, and I think we got to be clear. It's not that anybody, for example, I have a lot of respect. A lot of former students are in the military. There is a difference between that. And I don't think it's always understood popularly. Just because you can support the institution in a way doesn't mean that you support the policy decisions that are being run with it.
Well, my position is I support the troops, and I support them not being blown up in circumstances that are avoidable and ridiculous.
And isn't it strange on another level too? When you take a look at finally the war has begun to pull a little bit on Trump's polling numbers among his own base. I mean, obviously, it's pulled on the numbers more generally speaking. But Trump is the original, let's not have conflict. You'll know things are off if we go into Iran, right? And yet here we are. It's the best evidence that he has just no memory beyond a tweet. I mean, no other politician would have so brazenly done the antithesis of what he suggested he was going to do.
There's a great, I can't remember who wrote it now, but a New York Times column that people throw up, at Trump every so often, or at the Times in particular. But it was, Kamala the Hawk, Donald the Dove, or maybe, in the reverse order. But if you listen to what he was saying specifically, I mean, he had a lot of, it certainly sounded like he was going to go after Iran. He had this, vibe, that, I'm the peace president. And, he says that repeatedly and things like that. But he was certainly making belligerent comments about a lot of countries, so I'm not sure, I think on some level, I was just thinking about this morning for reasons, about, where does Trump sit vis-a-vis kind of the Republicans? And, I kind of that came before. And I feel like really, he's just kind of a neocon again in a lot of ways. He's isolationist on trade, but, he's been perfectly happy on multiple occasions now to kind of use military force to try to enforce our will on the world. And
I will actually give neocons a little bit more credit. They at least
they were tactical.
And they had a vision of the world in which they were attempting to support who they saw as the international order's good guys to prevent kind of a contemporary communism domino effect. That's an oversimplification, but I think an okay one for the purposes of our podcast. But for Trump, we don't have that, right? So, for example, Iran before the attack, while certainly not a friendly country, and of course supporting the Houthis, was not stopping the flow of trade, was not engaging in the kinds of behaviors that we would have maybe most worried about. And likewise, the thing that probably would have been more neocon, just going in and hitting their nuclear reactors and moving on with it, or their whatever you want to call their nuclear capability. Right, not exactly reactors at that point, if we understand properly. But we do that and then continue. And that's the part that I don't think fits the neocon mold, right? I mean, if you took the George W. Bush view of this, we would already have boots on the ground trying to win the hearts and the minds of the Iranians, and we might either find that funny or not, or viable or not viable. But that is, in fact, a plan, right? And I don't see the same kind of plan here, right?
No.
We're going to blow your civilization up. What does that even mean, right?
And I think that's fair. I suppose, I was using, I suppose the word I should have used is interventionist, because, neocon is something a little more specific and just happened to be the flavor of interventionists I grew up with.
Okay, I can hear that. I'm on board with that.
Yeah, but I do think, I think where you're right, whether you agree or disagree with the neocons, at least there was a theory there, At least they had an ethos, to quote the dude. And it's so true about neoconservatism, but at least it's an ethos. So whereas, with Trump, and I've harped on this before, and Hegseth is kind of the same, and so much of the administration, whether it's sort of domestic law enforcement or whether it's foreign policy, it's really all about the exercise of raw power.
Yeah, it's hard to overemphasize. You're absolutely right. And
I go back to that thing, talking about, when police arrest criminals, they should hit their heads on the side of the car on the way in.
This is
just
the
that
same
attitude
dude
permeates all of that. And,
what 10 days ago, he was arguing we need a high T,
you beat me
and this
to
is not
it,
a tease. It's not a tease, and it should be a tease. I mean, no, again, we can take issue with Donald Rumsfeld's view, although I think some of the things he thought about our knowns and unknown unknowns, while got gripes, actually there was some solidness to what he was saying.
I mean, that's
I don't
a legitimate
ever get
analysis.
solidness from Hegseth. There's no Condoleezza Rice. There's no, again, whether you thought they were doing bad things or not, I tend to think they were better intentioned than the left gave them credit for. Although I disagreed with many of those neocon policies. I don't see a similar thing from the high T Defense Department Hegseth, and I don't mean that as a joke.
No, and it's you beat me to the high T thing, which was just just absurd. And we mean high testosterone here, not
not the more
not
appropriate. Yeah, see, I would be all about it if we were going to have afternoon tea. I've got my whole set. We could get together. I'm up for a high tea. That kind of high tea. Come on,
this
over,
other high
let's do
tea,
it.
yeah. So, but it's just or Kash Patel bringing in the MMA to train the UFC to train FBI agents and things. I mean, just the kind of the theory of power here is it's like if you set a 12-year-old out to talk about what strength is, and there's just
I think even more concerningly, I see what you're going there. I would call it the media, it would be if you took movies and media as being the empirical reality. Yes. And use that as your data set for how you're going to behave. This is what you get.
And actually, that's a really interesting point because, I mean, Trump actually does consume giant amounts of media. There was that one episode a couple of years ago where, he's talking about border smugglers with super fast cars and things like that. That was apparently the plot of some awful movie that had run in the middle of the night, overnight. And I think so many of these guys. Actually, I would throw out there because Hegseth's generation is more of this, but, brought up on gaming,
Well, and I'll say, even as a gamer myself, one of the things, there's a really interesting new piece of literature that has come out on our side, and Cato and others were running with it. I haven't looked at all the details but what the bottom line takeaway is that, so for example, because of the number of encounters that we get with media. So in other words, this is not just a Trump thing. People, and we've known this for a while, they respond to what they see in their media environments, right? Mm-hmm. And it's a redo of an older study which saw that people's fear of violent crime was in no way correlated to the actual empirical violent crime they were experiencing or in their neighborhood, but to the instances of watching it once upon a time on the news. Today, what they see through their feeds. It's kind of an update on that. Because as a matter of fact, this upcoming year, it looks like this year, we're going to have one of the lowest crime rates in history in the United States. We're on track for that.
And yet people are up in arms about how the world's gone to hell in a handbasket.
Exactly. And it's not that people are just insane. It's that we are psychologically wired. We see all of that, and our bodies respond to that as opposed to the things that we're not experiencing.
Yeah. So, and I think to pull us maybe back to Iran a little bit, but, you had asked, exit ramp, where does this go? Yeah. I mean, I think, there's basically two options at this point, neither of which is what we've done. And, one is just to leave somehow, which I don't see Trump doing.
Well, and you can't because then Iran is going to hold the Strait of Hormuz, and he's not going to be willing to let that happen. I mean, nor should he, but
so but the other, I think, is kind of a ramp up, is a boots on the ground kind of situation, which I think is worse. But I don't see, I feel like this middle ground is politically untenable at this point. We've thrown $37.5 billion and 17 lives at this, and we're worse off than where we started on this strategy. So, you can cut and run, or you can ramp up. And, my concern is that there would be a ramp up. I don't know that Trump has the stomach for that. I don't know that the public has the stomach for that. They were promised something fast. I really think this is, in a lot of ways, Venezuela gave the president more confidence here, sort of not understanding that Venezuela and Iran are two very different places. But I don't see, staying this course just doesn't seem workable. Just sort of lobbing, aerial munitions and whatnot. And I've seen reports this week that, they've rebuilt a lot of the infrastructure that we've taken out, So I think, one thing that gets lost in this a little bit, one of the tempting things is to draw analogies. There's a great kind of political psych of foreign policy book called Analogies at War by Jung Foon Kong, his name was, that basically says, look, every time there's a conflict, decision makers look for an analogy to kind of give them guidance, and they mostly pick wrong. And, I think Venezuela was probably that, on some level, but also Iraq. But I think the problem here is that Iran is a much more capable nation militarily, resource-wise, et cetera.
And additionally, had we followed the game plan of Iraq, we would have potentially gone in during the protests. Yes, during the protest periods before they were assassinating those individuals.
And we would have boots on the ground almost immediately.
Immediately.
With overwhelming
we would have
force
put those individuals in charge, or attempted to.
Right.
And we didn't do those things. And as a matter of fact, I think that's maybe a good place to move forward, is the idea that Iran is, I've said this before, I'm going to say it again, the opportunity for Iran to experience internal change was destroyed by the order. We didn't have to go in, but by bombing when we did afterwards and creating this backlash, we have completely decimated what was clearly a growing grassroots movement in Iran for there to be some kinds of change. And that doesn't mean it would have happened in 30 seconds. I recognize
and if I could just toot my own horn, I can't reference you to the specific episode, but I will say called it.
Yeah, we had a long conversation about that. Remember, we talked about it, and you're right. I can't tell you the episode
because we've been talking about this for so damn long now. But
before the war even started, we talked about the movements and the protests in Iran, and then the backlash, and what's the United States going to do? And but okay, well, friend, let's move on. Let's move forward. And what we're going to move forward to, well, another international story in this way. While a lot of attention has been on Washington over funding bills and Iran, it might be worth mentioning that the House did pass a continuing resolution, but the Senate's going to sit on it. And so as a result, we decided not to spend too much time on that. But while all that was happening, our closest historic ally pulled off a rapid-fire leadership transition at 10 Downing Street. On Monday, Andy Burnham officially became Britain's 59th Prime Minister, taking over the government following the mid-term resignation of Starmer. Now, for those keeping score at home, and I know you do, Justin, Burnham is going to be Britain's 7th Prime Minister in one single turbulent decade. So that means for the last 10 years, there has been a new Prime Minister on average every 1.5 years. That's right. Every 1.5 years. And they think we're unstable when it comes to our cycles, Justin. But be that as it may, on Monday, now PM Burnham formally took office after meeting with King Charles III. Starmer, whom he is replacing, had resigned following a severe set of labor losses in local elections and some intense fallout over some of his international positions. However, I want to be careful. One of our other hosts, Michael Levy, argued that we ought to be careful on this front. This is his background. He's actually a British politics guy, and he wanted to be, he is not as certain that this international fallout over labor is because of kind of the potentially more hardline stance towards Trump. He sees that the issue has to do, well, not so much all domestically on that front. But I will say, so that was interesting to his insight, but that does run counter to some of the popular positions that we see being bantered about in the opinion pieces around the world, that this has more to do, not more, at least some to do with the refusal to permit U.S. military from using British bases for offensive strikes. And Burnham did, immediately hit the international phones, including with NATO afterwards. But be that particular explanatory mechanism, and I'm very happy that Michael gave us that kind of update there. What does this mean for the United Kingdom? I mean, just empirically speaking, it's hard to overstate how different the last decade of British politics in terms of prime ministers would be from, say, the preceding 100.
It did give one of my favorite memes, which was, "Will this lettuce in my fridge last longer than Liz Truss?" Yeah, so she did outlast. I think
that joke particularly hits right now, given the disease in the lettuce.
Exactly.
The anyway, the diarrhea.
But I mean, the turnover there, it seems like there is just a lot of dissatisfaction in the UK, from the public. And I think that's the turnover is indicative of that. And I think Brexit was indicative of that. I think Brexit was going absolutely in the opposite direction to solve their problems. And I think that's some of the fallout, but their growth, and where I'd be inclined to think of this in probably less Eurocentric or America-centric terms, their economic system has been really stagnant for years. And the sense that I have is that is likely a bigger driver than, sort of a giant groundswell of support for Donald Trump, amongst the English. As far as Burnham, this, I feel like in terms of relations with us, it's a little ambiguous. I think there are a couple different sort of directions, this could go. He has been in the past a pretty strong critic of President Trump. He's been a critic of the Iran war. I guess we can't call it a war, but I'm just gonna, for shorthand, it's
the Iran unauthorized. I don't know.
Unauthorized intermittent military action.
There we
go. House.
Listen, if we were going to be real political scientists, we'd come up for an acronym for this.
Yeah. It's gonna be percolating. It'll probably wake me up at 3 a.m. with something fantastic.
Just remember to write it down and share it to Discord.
So, but I think the it's a little hard to say. So, he's been critical, but then one of the first things he does is, we'll authorize strikes from British bases on Iran,
which is a relatively big shift.
That is a relatively big shift. On the other hand, he appointed Ed Miliband to his government, who's a fierce Trump critic who Trump absolutely hates, as foreign secretary. So it's kind of all over the map. It's a little hard, even to look at this, from the American perspective. It's a little hard to say.
On the British side, I don't know if you saw, he already had to have a couple of U-turns in his own policies, right? He came out with some shifts to tax policy, but those got struck down almost immediately, and he makes a U-turn on that. And what I mean by that is I'm not so interested in the particular policies, but the churn of this brand new prime minister coming out with something, then retracting them, and then coming out with something else. That's also strange in British politics, which is oftentimes a lot more stable and long run. It's one of the things that oftentimes confuses Americans who look at it because
parliamentary parties are much more programmatic. Typically.
Yes. And so to see that kind of turn from our point of view seems normal, but from their point of view suggests continued instability. That'd be my suggestion.
Yeah. And I think that's fair. I suppose, if I were willing to risk buying lettuce at this point, we could see if it outlasts Andy Burnham. But, I do wonder how this will play out, and if there will be another U-turn. Sort of one interesting thing that kind of in the immediate aftermath of the kind of B-1 launches from England, Iran was already threatening to retaliate, against them. And I don't know. I mean, they say things like that all the time. On the other hand, certainly, one well-placed car bomb or something like that, becomes, I think, tougher, for the British to sustain that relationship at that point. To loop back to something we were talking about a minute ago, American support for this has been pretty soft already, and I think is getting softer as costs mount. I'm not sure that the British, it's not their war. And I think, maybe they're interested in escalating a little bit, but gosh, if anything comes home, at all to them, I think the blowback would be pretty fierce in a hurry. And so, I don't know sort of how long that military relationship is sustainable. Again, to be clear, I am not advocating for car bombings or, anything like that. But, this is a relatively costless action for them for the moment. And they're really not, committing any kind of other support. But at the point that they do, I have to wonder, does that become a problem for the government, whether it's, suffering a terrorist attack or, God, if they actually start committing military assets or something like that, which doesn't seem to be on the table for the time being, how much support the British would really have for that.
Well, I popped up some of the data for that, and right now only 25% of the British public express support for the U.S. military strikes against Iran. And then if you kind of want to get into that more narrow, the U.S.-based access controversy, about 58% of Britons oppose allowing the U.S. To using sovereign military bases for offensive strikes against Iranian targets. So that's a pretty big deal, and especially for labor, given their unique relationship with conflict on those fronts. So yeah, that it's a very difficult position to be in, but at the same time, you're not wrong. Being in a relationship with Donald Trump is fraught with its own problems. I mean, that's something we're going to talk about in the next story with tariffs, and I don't want to get to that yet, but you can't not, I am sure if I was working for the PM, you couldn't just blow that off either.
Right. And that's certainly one thing that's been noticeable there is that, he's said some pretty harsh things about Trump, going back to, 2016. And, when you're, mayor, you can get away with that stuff, I suppose, but yeah, I mean, the fact of the matter is, while Trump is problematic in so many ways, if you are a foreign leader, you have to deal with him on some level, and you kind of have to kiss his ass on some level, because he seems to like that. But that is the president, and it is a powerful office. And, I think the concern that Burnham's going to have is, does he get burned domestically on this? Because so many people that enter into transactions, if you will, with Trump end up getting burned in one way or another. And I'm not sure that this, it's tough. I mean, you can't, you can't just show up, with whatever the staid British equivalent of two middle fingers is, to Trump. But at the same time, and I appreciate you grabbing some actual numbers there. I don't know that the public's going to have the stomach for much of this, and so
no.
Kind of balancing those domestic and international. I mean, you can't not engage with him. You just, as if you're going to be a Western nation, that's who's in charge. That's who you got to play ball with. But I think the domestic fallout from this could be pretty big. And
yeah. Well, let us continue to be a little international and make another pivot, Justin, to tariffs. So we had some financial policy and statutory gymnastics this past week. As a matter of fact, yesterday, which went into effect this morning at the U.S. Trade Representative's office. So Ambassador Greer formally announced sweeping new tariffs under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, targeting 60 major trading partners that represent approximately 90% of all American imports. The Trump administration argues that they are designed to combat forced labor. Okay. Is that true? Well, the administration is slapping a 10% tariff on partners with forced labor laws on the books, including Canada, the EU, and the United Kingdom. I mean, I know there's a lot of forced labor going on in Canada. I've heard about that. People are always fleeing south to escape. Now,
so as it is, I was going to make a joke about maple syrup, but actually, to go the other direction, part of why maple syrup became popular in the northern part of the U.S. was because it was not made with slavery. So apparently, forced labor and maple syrup, just not really compatible.
You got to be careful. You've got to be careful. Now, they also put on a 12.5% tariff on 46 other economies, ranging from China to India to Norway and Japan. But in all honesty, listeners, this has to do with the calendar, not with labor policies. Back in February, the Supreme Court struck down President Trump's emergency tariffs. And to keep things moving, the administration enacted a set of temporary 10% global tariffs under Section 122. But those tariffs have a 150-day statutory limit. And do you know when they would have ended? Last night. That is Thursday night of this week, as we're recording on Friday. So Thursday's Section 301 forced labor announcement, which then went into effect this morning at midnight 05, was really a way to create a pre-planned permanent replacement to those temporary so-called tariffs. Now, this already comes on top of a relatively aggressive multi-front trade tariff offensive this past week. 50% tariff on Canadian automobiles, dairy, and timber taking effect in August under Section 338. A 25% tariff on Brazil that hit on Wednesday. and a Truth Social directive mapping out a phased 200% on imported generic pharmaceuticals by 2029 to force drug manufacturing, in Trump's words, back to American soil. So again, the tariffs that we're primarily talking about went into effect this morning, Friday, July 24th. And it's also interesting from reporting from the Wall Street Journal that it does not appear that there is any country that could even potentially earn a 0% tariff, because even the ones who have labor laws are, in the Trump administration's purview, not sufficient enough. And so no one could have a 0% tariff at this question. So the question is, of course, will this pass constitutional muster, Justin? And further, even if it doesn't, which seems like that has been the answer for many of these economic policies anyway, that the administration will just find yet another obscure way to impose yet more tariffs. What are your thoughts on the tariff pivot? Yeah.
The second one. Yeah. I think one thing that we've seen is, this tariff authority for the president is, it's ensconced in a lot of places. There are lots of different authorities under which the president can impose tariffs. And, I think this is basically constitutional whack-a-mole at this point, where, he's been shot down once and immediately turns around and, imposes other emergency tariffs. And, there's a mismatch between the branches here, I think, because the president can act quickly and the Supreme Court, they could act quickly, I suppose, if they wanted to shadow docket this, but they're tremendously slow. What was that, 6-9 months, something like that?
Yeah, February.
You missed the chance to say 6-7 months, with...
I'm sorry, I missed our 6-7 joke. My apologies.
Yeah, this is the parents of tweens, both of us. So, but I think we're going to keep seeing tariffs here, because I do understand this fixation a little bit, but, Trump, I don't think he's committed to any of these underlying principles. These labor arguments are just BS.
He's committed
to having
mercantilism.
Tariffs.
He's committed to mercantilism.
I think it's, he has this, kind of, again, speaking of analogies and picking the wrong one, he has this kind of Gilded Age vision of, the American economy was great when we did tariffs and not income taxes. And I think on some level, that's really what he, his ideal position. He's stated this a few times that, should get rid of the income tax and replace it with tariffs. And, never mind that, the economy was just, the number of crazy recessions and depressions and things that we had during that period. It was a terrible economy in a lot of ways.
Even if you push that back, though, it does not fit with the amount of money that he wants to spend.
Right.
Right. The other part here that just blows my mind. Could you do something like that? Maybe, right? I will grant you it couldn't be a possibility. You're right. We'd have to talk about the details of, is that a good possibility or not? But I think it is at least there's a scenario in which it's doable, but it's definitively not doable when you're spending the amount of money that we're spending and have no end of that in sight. You're going to be
paying $80,000 for a Honda Accord is the kind of levels that you would need to.
Well, and be honest, that would not be the thing that I think hits people the hardest. It would be the day-to-day items that would end up being just. Right now the cost of
$3 worth of tomatoes on a Whopper.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's where people just they can't begin to fathom what it would cost. There's actually this book. It's I don't know. It's good in a way, but it's also a little hokey. It's a parable about free trade, and basically the free trade guy has to come back and convince somebody, as a ghost, to be for free trade, and they kind of go through all of the things that would be bad on the other way, and it's pretty good on those fronts, right? And one of the points in the book that I think is in fact accurate is the average person doesn't recognize how much their life would change if you actually did completely cut off or do what Trump is suggesting, which is have just these enormously high Gilded Aged tariffs.
Absolutely. I've got a couple of friends who work in heavy manufacturing kind of management stuff, and without naming names, but if you know where I live, you know exactly what company it is. But
we got to look this up now.
Look this up. John Deere. I mean, they build them. They build the 9000 series tractors that cost.
Without looking it up, that would have been my first guess. But okay.
Yeah, so literally like a mile and a half from my house, they build $500,000 tractors. But I mean that just to use that as an example, or any number of other things, so many ostensibly American items are full of foreign components. So I had a conversation with my friend, and a lot of his job was going and kind of negotiating sourcing deals on parts. So your made in Waterloo, Iowa $500,000 tractor. It's got a German fuel pump in it, and things of that nature. And even just kind of little components. I mean, we don't make stuff like we don't make a lot of little componenty things. Even of things that we assemble here. I'm sitting in my music room right now, which is too messy to show, spin the camera around. But, I'm looking at a Fender American-made tube amplifier, right now. And I'm sure all of the transistors and whatnot in it were probably Chinese. I know for a fact that the tubes in it are Slovenian because there are no, American, tubes anymore. But this is just, I'm now rambling to reiterate your point, is that even, we can't just redo all of this. If you tariff all of this stuff, because I think, nothing, we're so interconnected economically that, nothing is truly domestic anymore.
And let's be honest, that's not a bad thing when you're talking about other democracies.
That's Adam Smith and the invisible hand of the market. It was about trade. It wasn't about domestic policy.
Now, can it break down? And I'm willing to have conversations about that in terms of, authoritarian regimes or actual real labor practices. 100% I'm willing to have that conversation. And I think most of us are. But as you pointed out, there's no universe in which I don't want things moving between Germany and the United Kingdom and Canada, right? Those should just be absolute give-me's of human and good movement to the best extent that we can, as long as we're not somehow poking somebody so specifically that it's going to, destroy them, right? I mean,
and I think I'd come out, I agree with all of that, but even if you don't sort of accept that premise, the costs and difficulties of changing this, it's kind of a path dependence argument, are astronomical. Bringing back transistor manufacturing to the United States, or, various raw materials that we don't have in abundance, or things like that. You can't just turn this around. And again, from talking to my friends, who do not represent necessarily the views of their company, although none of this is controversial. Their sourcing plans are like 5 and 6 years out, in a lot of manufacturing. And so, if you start disrupting supply chains, that becomes highly problematic, because you are, you can't just go out and buy American when the price on something goes up.
Precisely.
Sorry, I had an and, but I didn't mean it.
No, it's all. Here's where we should probably finish that. And and it's a good point from your friends. I like that you bring that in there about John Deere. But that timeline, not only is it correct, but when you think about it as a scientist, what that suggests is that any company is going to wait out one particular administration, because this is an aberration.
Why would you build a component factory in the U.S. that's going to take you 3 or 4 years when this is probably going to go away?
Come into effect as soon as the next. There doesn't appear to be any universe when the next Republican or the next Democrat is going to have this same kind of connection. So no, you're just going to say, you know what? It's going to cost everybody another 200%, for their drug in the short term, and we'll look like heroes when we bring it down by maybe not all 200%, but maybe 125% to start with, right? We'll look like absolute heroes in a few years, and we'll just see what happens, right? There's no universe. But let's continue to move forward, Justin, and let's move and finish the show out with Arizona. So, I mean, those of us who are probably, and that's probably you and me, a bit too deeply involved in politics, was paying attention to the primaries in Arizona. So if you're listening to the show, you might fall into that category. But I don't know if everybody kind of gets into the minutia of this, but there were some really unique things happening in Arizona. In a complete sweep of the state's Republican primaries, GOP voters actually nominated a full ticket of candidates whose political identities were forged in the efforts to overturn the 2020 election. That is absolutely true. Leading the ticket is Congressman Andy Biggs, who defeated Representative Swertwerker to win the nomination for governor. Biggs formally objected to certifying Arizona's electoral results on January 6, several others, and sought a presidential pardon after the Capitol attack for his efforts to overturn the results. Joining him on the November ballot includes Alexander Culloden for Secretary of State. That's the secretariat sanctioned by the state for filing 2020 election frivolous lawsuits, and State Senate President Peterson for Attorney General, the main architect behind the Cyber Ninjas audit, which was obviously just a giant conspiracy theory. So these candidates, though, they see this as a referendum on election themselves. The gentleman talking on PBS said in a joint interview that Arizona voters want transparency and openness in their elections. To quote, "I think voters in this primary and across the state have serious concerns with the way their elections are being administered," end quote. And so this sets up a pretty direct high-stakes clash in November between incumbent Democrats who've spent 4 years managing the state's election machinery and a challenger ticket promising to overhaul it and to challenge its very integrity. So I think some have assumed that this is maybe moderated as time has gone on. That I disagree with that view. I think that is still a very popular position among actual Republicans. I think most Republicans still see this is a number one priority when I talk with people more individually. But I'm curious what you think about what we get from these Arizona primaries about this or anything, Justin.
Yeah, that's really become, I think, an article of faith and kind of a litmus test. On the right is, election denial from 2020. It's not entirely surprising that you would see that in the primaries. And honestly, without kind of having gone through all of them, my suspicion is that probably the people they beat were not substantially better on this issue. It does not seem like you can exist in a lot of Republican spaces at this point as a candidate without buying that. I do have some questions about how relevant or how viable this is as a general election strategy. This is one of those things. I think you're absolutely right. It is a hot issue if you are MAGA. It is a less interesting issue if you're a non-MAGA Republican. Both of them.
I want to interject just a little bit, and that is when I look at the data for this, I actually think while the MAGA level of support.
Are those the ones that don't have magic?
Yeah, exactly. They're muggles. I'm sorry. But the MAGA, I believe that when you actually clear-eyedly look at the data, and if you go talk with real human beings in these locations, I think one of the mistakes that Democrats are making is that they don't realize that this is more salient than they're giving it credit for. So while I think the median voter is not a Jan 6, don't hear me, I'm not saying that. But what I'm suggesting is they go, those guys are nuts, and the but is our elections aren't as secure as they ought to be. Now, that's not me making a position. I'm not taking that, but I'm calling out what I see as being an empirical, identifiable position. And I think Democrats have seen these guys are, empirically, their claims are outlandish. Let's put it that way. There's no universe in which 2020 was a stolen election. But I think the average voter says, but elections are screwed up. That's where I think there's some. I think this is more potentially popular than it has been given credit for because of the craziness.
Yes, yeah, I have kind of mixed feelings on that. I mean, I'm inclined to think that, especially to the extent that you dwell on it. It'll be interesting to see what their general campaigns look like. I think for the average voter, again, one of the things in the American system, is that you get more extreme voters in the primaries than you get in general elections.
It's called the median voter theory as you get to the,
And, it's not only because it's only Republicans showing up in the Republican primary and Democrats showing up in the Democratic primary, but, the turnout in those is crazy low. And so typically it is the more ideologically extreme people that have that have the willingness to show up and vote. And that gets us in a whole other direction. But I think that plays really well there. I'm not sure, as people really harp on this, to the exclusion of all kinds of stuff that people care about. If you are only talking election fraud and not talking prices and not talking employment and things like that, I think it's going to be a problem for them. In what you said, though, I do think there is something to that. And I think someplace where Democrats have been really weak, is on rhetoric and sort of countering. And this is going back for a long time. In fact, I would go so far back as 2010 is the wheels kind of came off. You had a bunch of Democrats basically running away from Obamacare during the 2010 elections. And I think one of the issues here, I think a twofold issue, or two different sides of the same issue, I suppose. One is that just rhetorically, they are not playing to their strengths. They're not punching up kind of the programs that they've got that would be popular. But the other, when you cede that space, then Republican rhetoric takes over. And this would be true in the other direction. It just happens that, Democrats are really ceding that space. But I see that on so many issues, where they are not presenting sort of a counter narrative. Like, they're just not engaging. They're not engaging. They're playing defense on the rhetoric of immigration. They're playing defense on, a lot of things, basically. But I think
voting is a good example, right? The singular biggest response from Democrats, and it's not wrong, but it's a response, is look what's going to happen to women. If we pass these kinds of bills, the ability of women to vote is going to become much more difficult, especially those who've had name changes. And that's absolutely true. But that, to my mind, seemingly is the singular big response.
Well, I'll give you a second one, and it's not, and it's true, and it's what I believe. We do need video. I'm super gesturing right here.
You are gesturing.
Fire it up. But the other response, which I think is accurate, is that this is mostly a non-issue. So many of these, oh my God, here's illegals voting or whatever, it's just a vanishingly small number. The problems that we have are greatly exaggerated, but it's really hard. And I talked to probably Jay about this, in the run up to 2024, the economy is not as bad as you say it is, which is true, is not a winning political position. And I think, at this point, I think this is kind of that same issue. All of this stuff is massively overblown. I mean, if you look at the Heritage stuff, which is a great resource, their oh my God report of, how many illegal immigrants are voting. And it's like it's not even a rounding error. I mean, it's,
I believe it wasn't it something in the realm of 100 people?
Something like country? That. And I could say in Iowa, we had, and we have, I think, I'm actually pretty fond of our Republican Secretary of State, just in case you think I don't say nice things about Republicans ever. I was just on a call with him kind of for the newspaper podcast, much like this. And he's a very reasonable, person, but his office put out a report on, how many illegal immigrants had voted in Iowa over the last, I don't know, it was 10 or 12 elections. And it worked out to like 30 an election, basically. And again, people hear this and say, well, it should be zero. Well, there's all kinds.
And murder should be zero too, but that doesn't mean that.
And we could solve drunk driving if everybody had an interlock in their car, but we don't. And we have to balance, those considerations. But that's a message that, one, isn't getting. Well, I guess primarily it's not getting through and it doesn't seem viable. I think you're absolutely right that Democrats probably need to counter with some sort of, reasonable election security, sort of thing. Unfortunately, as is often the case with Democratic things, the answer tends to be some sort of technocratic solution that's not very exciting. The Republicans, I think, God, who was it? Somebody had an article in the APSR about 30 years ago about kind of easy and hard issues, kind of in terms of how to talk about them. And even then, I think the implication was Republicans had really zeroed in on like easy framings of things, and
yeah.
I feel
just for listeners, we're talking about the American Political Science Review.
Sorry about that.
It's one of the flagship journals in political science. Does a lot of quant work. So I just went, you said, I just thought listeners might be going,
I try to be very good about I try to be so good about not dropping jargon. And then, there I go.
Well, that wasn't so much jargon. It's just one of those, it's a title thing that, you
it's
kind of
just in my DNA at this point,
but that actually is probably not a bad example of, I think, what sometimes happens to Democrats when they're trying to
here I am
things.
Embodying the problem that I've got is
right. They bring all of this pre-existing knowledge to the table, and they assume that their audience is already going to be there. And that is not the case. I always tell people, when you're thinking about how to help or talk about the electorate or show whatever you're trying to do, you got to think like you're teaching a gen ed class. And that means that they don't have a basis. You got to start from that assumption and move forward. But
absolutely. And just to kind of, I don't think it even needs to be a compromise position necessarily, just an alternate position. I think but that does something.
Exactly. There's a difference between a compromise and in other words, it's just something that you can brand as your better
But I think
version.
The problem is, what they can brand is, there is where I was going before I totally sidetracked us again, is this Republican version is very tangible. We make you show an ID. We make you show your birth certificate. The ID at this point, enough states do it. And I'm past caring about that on some level. I think it's a silly idea on a little bit, but in the end, like that is, that ship has kind of sailed. The birth certificate thing is absurd. The proof of citizenship thing is just ridiculous because of the logistics, but that is a really easy, tangible thing that people can get their heads around. And, I don't think anything that the Democrats offer up, I think there are lots of things that you could do, and it's all like, database hygiene and things like that. It's really hard to build a slogan around, save America through, less errors in our Excel spreadsheets.
Yeah, well, that's fair. Well, Justin, I think I'm going to pause this there.
We've about come to time. We've gone past time, probably.
We have gone past, but that's okay. I will finish where I started, though, and that is a reminder. If you want to see Justin gesturing, there we go. We've already got our slogan. Justin gesturing.
I've got a face made for podcasting, unfortunately, and I'm coming live from my basement bunker, but I'm going to have to step up my visual game here. But I am a hand talker, I've discovered. Like,
we all are.
I was at a conference a couple years ago where I got fired up about something and like knocked a glass of iced tea off the table, which just weird because I'm a very mellow person, and here I am. Anyway.
Well, if you want to see Justin gesturing in July,
alliteration.
Here I am. This is why we make the money, folks. But that's true. It's funny, but it's true. If you become a new supporter or you increase your level of support and 25 people do that here in the last week of July, you will get to see in all seriousness, Justin gesturing. You'll get to see my office. You'll get to see, I don't know, the copious amounts of carbonated water that I drink through the course of a show. Maybe we'll have to put like visuals up, that could be kind of funny. We could have a whiteboard. I don't know. We'll figure that out if we have 25 people who either become new supporters or increase their level of support here in the next week for July. We're almost there. I know we've got a number. I should have looked at the number. I don't know what the exact number is right now, but I do know we have some doing that. Even if we don't have that happen, don't forget, by becoming a new supporter or increasing your support in the next week, i.e. anytime in July, you'll also get into a drawing to have a free year of membership at whatever level of support you're currently at. And don't forget, there's still the benefit of July because we've got that almost free first month. Again, Patreon doesn't allow for a completely free first month. So you either get 90% off your first month for monthly supporters, or don't forget, you can get an additional 10% off for yearly supporters. That's on top of the discount you're already getting for going for the longer distance. So to take advantage of those deals, you're going to need to use the promo codes that are located down in the show notes. It's 0943D and 9B50C. But again, don't try to write that down. Just head down to the show notes and become a supporter of the show today. Get the discount, get entered into a drawing, and become part of the video future of the Politics Guys. And some individuals who have been supporters forever are going to be our executive producers. And they are Wilmer Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, Jody Marie Miller, and Sean Fugit. We'll be back with a full episode upcoming this weekend. And don't forget, we'll always have our Explorers Borders exclusive show here on Tuesday. I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,